Greetings. Father Mark signing on, continuing the series on the papacy in modern history, moving into the reign of Pope 249, Pope Clement XIV, who reigned from 1769 to 1774. As often happens after the passing of a strong leader, the conclave of 1769 found itself bereft of a solid sense of purpose and direction, which Clement XIII had provided. Against the relentless pressure from the royal houses of Europe, even though still claiming to be Catholic, and after the military occupation of parts of papal territory, the cardinals in conclave were, frankly, afraid, and they were looking for a solution. It took them 3 months to decide what to do. There were, among their number, some Zelanti cardinals, what we'd call conservatives today, who preferred to see the church face another universal persecution or even some more schisms, rather than give in to monarchs who claimed to be Catholic but were behaving no better than grasping materialist atheists. Yet such a course of action requires courage and fortitude, and as the final vote proved, 2/3 of the 46 cardinals searched their souls and did not find those two virtues present. So instead, they elected a gentle, peace-loving Franciscan as Pope 249. He accepted election on May 19th, 1769. His, his personal and moral, I want to clarify, and his personal and moral life, his simplicity of life, all of that was beyond reproach. So there's no more the Renaissance popes, having illegitimate children and all that stuff. None of that. Yet he lacked the inner strength of his predecessor to face opposition in defending the good. And in that, a good man with the best of intentions, yet he lacked the strength that the church needed at this time, and the church suffered for it, as we'll see. Okay, he was born near Rimini in 1705 on October 31st. He was baptized with the name Giovanni Ganginelli, Ganelli. He entered the Franciscan, or the Order of Friars Minor, and as a Franciscan in religion, he was given the name Lorenzo. As Pope, he took the name Clement, Clement XIV. He reigned for slightly over 5 years, and so far, he has been the last truly bad pope in church history, in the way that I just described. Not morally bad or spiritually bad, just bad in the sense of not having what was needed to care for the church's interests. Clement XIV's reign began badly. It began by appeasing the enemies of the church. First, he wanted to heal the breach with Portugal, which, recall, broke off diplomatic relations with the Holy See 9 years earlier, in 1760, when Clement XIII refused to bend to the will of the Marquis de Pombal, and which would have meant approving their unjust exile of the Jesuits, and the criminal theft of the property belonging to the order. In a completely shameless display, Clement XIV offered to make the Marquis de Pombal's brother a cardinal in exchange for restoring relations between the Kingdom of Portugal and the Holy See. And for those of you not watching these videos sequentially, Pombal is the Marquis de Pombal was the chief minister in service to the monarchy of Portugal. So he was the one that was actually making policy. After 11 years of Clement XIII's resolute defense and defiance of Europe, even Pombal was stunned at this complete reversal. And instead of agreeing immediately, he just waited to see how far the new pope would go to appease. As Pombal didn't care if relations were ever restored with the Holy See, because he was an atheist. The Bishop of Coimbra had been arrested and imprisoned by Pombal a decade earlier because he published, without government permission, Pope Clement XIII's condemnation of some of the Enlightenment writings that we covered in the previous reign. To ingratiate himself further with Pombal, Clement XIV canonically removed that bishop from his diocese while that guy was still in jail unjustly. And he offered to Pombal, said, you choose his successor, and I will approve it as Pope. And Pombal did it. Clement further even offered, when Pombal still did not take the bait and restore diplomatic relations, Clement further said, if you restore diplomatic relations, then the nuncio, the ambassador, can be a person of your choosing, if only you agree to reopen formal diplomatic relations between the Kingdom of Portugal and the Holy See. In return, Pombal gave exactly nothing. The stolen Jesuit property was not restored. The law of expulsion of the society was not revoked. Those Jesuits who were thrown in jail, imprisoned unjustly, that were not released. No pressure was expected that Pombal exert pressure on other governments to reverse their own criminal acts against the Jesuits. After all of this appeasement, Pombal agreed only to reopening the nunciature in Lisbon. And Clement IV was so disconnected from reality, he considered that a dazzling diplomatic triumph for his papacy. Meanwhile, the 4,000 Jesuit refugees still languishing in the Papal States had no place else to go. When word of this appeasement was spread to all the royal houses of Europe, they reached the same conclusion. Clement XIV was spineless and could easily be taken advantage of. The Spanish ambassador to the Holy See, a guy named Jose Monino, started increasing pressure on Clement XIV for complete suppression of the Jesuits, of the Society of Jesus. Now remember, Spain was ruled at this point by the Bourbon dynasty, no longer by the Habsburgs. There were still Habsburgs in Europe in power. They were on the throne of Austria and held the Holy Roman Empire. But the Habsburgs had been seriously weakened by losing in a series of the dynastic wars of the 18th century, such that the Bourbons now controlled France, Spain, Naples, Sicily, and Parma, along with the limitless wealth of the Spanish colonies in the New World, which included gold and silver mines. The reigning Habsburg ruler was Maria Theresa of Austria. Now, she did not want to see the Jesuits suppressed, but she was aging, she felt isolated since her beloved husband died, and she was tired. Fearing that her dynasty would fall if she did not reach some kind of accommodation with the Bourbons, she opened negotiations with France for the marriage of one of her daughters, Marie Antoinette, to the heir of the throne of France, whom the French called the Dauphin, was the title. Like the English was the Prince of Wales. In France, it was the Dauphin. And that guy, prince at this point, but he would later become King Louis XVI. The price for her agreement to join in the pressure, the price of France agreeing to the marriage between Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette was that Marie Antoinette's mother, Maria Theresa, agree to join in the pressure on the Pope to suppress the Jesuit order. Now, she did not go that far, but in April of 1773, she did write to the Pope that she would not oppose a decision by the Pope to suppress the Jesuits if the Pope deemed that expedient for the unity of the Church. So that was diplomatic speak, letting the Pope know she was not going to fight for the Jesuits. So with the Habsburgs not willing to protect the society, and with the House Bourbon, the House Braganza of Portugal, House Wittelsbach in Bavaria, and House Grimaldi in Monaco, all pushing for suppression, Pope Clement XIV could only have resisted if he had a deep reservoir of spiritual depth. Since he did not have that, he gave in. On August 16, 1773, Pope Clement XIV canonically suppressed the Society of Jesus. The Apostolic Constitution, or the papal bull, affecting the action was Dominus ac Redemptor Noster. And the Jesuits remained in this condition, suppressed for the next 41 years. Unlike the suppression of the Knights Templar in 1312 by Clement V, no moral or theological sins were alleged as justifying the suppression. Clement's decree merely stated that the suppression was being ordered for, quote, the advantage of the church and the tranquility of the nations, end quote. The Jesuit property and all their other assets were, of course, stolen by the various governments involved. Even in the Papal States, the Pope transferred the property and churches of the Jesuits to other religious communities. He gave the Gesù, the Jesuit church in Rome, to his own Franciscan order. And as if that were not enough, just in case there might have been one or two individuals on the planet who had some doubt that Clement XIV was indeed spineless, Clement further gave in to a demand by the Spanish ambassador that the superior general of the society, Lorenzo Ricci, along with 13 leaders of the society, the chapter, well, they don't call it that, but their analog to a chapter, at the time of the suppression, be arrested in order to prevent them from rallying the society again. So not arrested for anything that they did or were alleged to do, but because to prevent them from something that they might consider doing in the future. And Clement gave in. They were all kept in solitary confinement, and they all died in prison. Another 1,500 Jesuits died because of bestial confinement they endured on ships, transporting them from the Spanish and Portuguese colonies in the New World for banishment in the Papal States, and they just died on the way. The other members of the society fared either well or badly, depending on their location. Maria Theresa of Austria was never comfortable with her agreement to this act, and she was overcome with remorse when she heard about all the atrocities, the injustices. Since she gained control over all former Jesuit property in her realm, she offered to allow Austrian Jesuits to continue functioning as they had before in either parishes or schools, as long as they agreed to live as secular priests, transferring their obedience to the bishop of the diocese where the institution was. This remained an option in Habsburg lands as long as she lived, which included Austria, Hungary, her part of the Netherlands, Tuscany, and various small German states which routinely followed the Habsburg lead in foreign policy. In the United States, well, it wasn't the United States yet, but in the 13 colonies of Great Britain, which became the United States, there were very few Catholics and very few priests, but those they had were, for the most part, Jesuits, Anglo-Catholic Jesuit, English Catholic Jesuits. One of them was John Carroll, the guy who became later the first bishop when the United States was created. So John Carroll was a Jesuit, and the other Jesuits who were living in Maryland with him, also, they just became secular priests and preserved the property of the order by forming a corporation called the Society of the Reverend Gentlemen. The society also found protection in two unlikely countries, non-Catholic countries, Lutheran Prussia and Orthodox Russia. This was because the King of Prussia, Frederick the Great, hated the French, and he wanted to annoy the Bourbons. So since the Bourbons wanted the Jesuits suppressed, then he would protect the Jesuits. And Russia, the ruler of Russia, the Tsarina, was Catherine the Great. She protected them because she respected their ability as educators. Now, if this had happened at another time in history, the society would have also found refuge in Poland, but for reasons to be discussed shortly. Poland had ceased to exist as an independent nation the year before the society was suppressed. In evaluating Pope Clement XIV, it must be kept in mind that as Pope, he was completely within his canonical rights to suppress the Jesuits or any other religious order. A Pope can do that anytime, and he doesn't even need a reason. Yet, taking such an action against a society of 20,000 members at the time, whose record of accomplishment in the missions and education was historic, cannot be considered a right act. Undertaking such an action merely to placate anti-Catholic secular monarchs who were salivating to steal from the church was a horrible precedent to set. The brutal, and in many cases homicidal, treatment of the members of the society who were not even accused of a crime, let alone actually guilty of one, is just simply immoral. Now, we have encountered immoral popes before, earlier, in this playlist and another playlist. But theirs was an immorality which harmed their souls and which did give bad example. Yet Clement XIV's immorality cost lives and damaged the entire church. 13 months after the suppression, Clement XIV died on September 22, 1774. His body had turned a putrid black color, so all of Rome assumed that he had been poisoned. And the next pope, Pius VI, always believed that he had been poisoned. The Marquis de Pombal in Portugal died in hideous pain. He died of leprosy, of all things. The marriage of Maria Theresa's daughter, Marie Antoinette, to the Dauphin of France, who became Louis XVI, was cursed from the moment Maria agreed to the suppression as a condition of sealing the agreement. Both Maria's daughter and her husband were murdered during the French Revolution on the guillotine after suffering much humiliation in prison, as we'll cover in a future video. But before we leave Clement's reign, there's another event of historic importance that must be covered. It really falls within the realm of secular history, but because it affected a Catholic kingdom and almost 100% Catholic population, we have to cover it. And this is the partition of Poland in August of 1772. The partition of Poland occurred the year before the suppression of the Jesuit order. Cover it separately because the papacy was not involved in any way. The background cause for this injustice was yet another of the continuing dynastic wars which occupied Europe for centuries, in this case, the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, which in its North American theater of operations was called the French and Indian War, which I cover in much more detail in that playlist on the American church history. I think it's titled Catholicism in U.S. History. It was, in reality, the conflict was a continuation of the War of the Austrian Succession, because Maria Theresa had never reconciled herself to losing the territory of Silesia that Frederick the Great conquered from her. Investing vast amounts of money and time, she had the Austrian army completely remodeled in imitation of what she had observed in Frederick the Great's armies. And then the 7 Years' War, ensued. The belligerents were, on one side, Prussia, Great Britain, and Great Britain's American colonies, Portugal, Hanover, Brunswick. On the other side, Austria, France, and all of the French colonies, which included Louisiana and Canada, Spain, Naples, Sicily, Russia, Sweden, Saxony, Sardinia. When it was done, 1.4 million people were dead. France lost its American possessions. Canada went to Great Britain. The Louisiana Territory went to Spain. Maria Theresa failed to recover her lost territory from the previous war and lost even more territory to Frederick the Great. It was that weakness which caused her to agree to to participate in the partition of Poland on August 5, 1772. She had been informed that Russia and Prussia were simply going to invade Poland and occupy, just steal, parts of Poland, and just add it to their country as essentially colonies, and internal European colonies. So she felt if she did not annex a part of Poland bordering her territory, that she would have these two enemy military machines entirely too close for comfort. No one, of course, had consulted the Poles about their political extermination. Not exterminate. I mean, they weren't all slaughtered, but the political extinction of their kingdom. Caught completely by surprise by the simultaneous invasion of three armies from three different directions, the Poles nevertheless fought tenaciously. 120,000 were killed defending their homeland, but the odds were just too great. A three-front war. But they held out for 3 years. It's astonishing. But after 3 years, the survivors accepted that they were just going to be ruled by foreigners. As said, Pope Clement XIV died on September 22nd, 1774, after a disastrous reign of 5 years and 4 months. His successor, Pope Pius VI, and the monarchs of Europe would reap the whirlwind for their behavior in the French Revolution and the generation of war that followed it. And so the French Revolution occurred in the reign of the next pope, Pope Pius VI. And so it is to that we will turn in the next video. So for now, thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.